We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
If you think about the timeline, the human rights story, the modern human rights story, starts in 1948 with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. By its very nature, that declaration was a statement of intent and didn't necessarily at that time create binding norms on states. Only 2 years later, however, in 1950, the Council of Europe celebrated its new Convention on Human Rights. And that particular European Convention created that bulwark by which the states within the Council of Europe came together to insist that these standards were not mere aspirations, but were in fact binding obligations for all states that would sign and ratify the European Convention of Human Rights. Today it's the most famous of the regional systems that exist in the world and easily the most sophisticated. But here's a crucial element to it. The European Convention on Human Rights is very much posited as a convention that is overtly concerned with the civil and political rights of its citizens, but the text per se doesn't pay adequate attention to economic and social rights, and as a consequence doesn't say very much about the right to development at all. Fortunately, many people who operate within this particular regime have, of course, beliefs in the indivisibility of rights. That means that they understand that the human condition requires the protection and promotion of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights, and that human rights are in fact indivisible. The Inter-American Convention, passed in a different decade, but very much following the model set up by the European Convention on Human Rights, has rights that are framed in a very similar vein. This particular convention, set up by the Organization of American States, has an Inter-American Court and has a rich source of development of rights. From the perspective of minorities and indigenous peoples, this particular system is very sophisticated indeed. It deals with some fascinating cases on land rights and some fascinating questions around the extent to which indigenous culture may conflict with human rights questions. Needless to say, however, because the Inter-American system too is based on the model of the European Convention of Human Rights, it too doesn't have any strong exhortations with regards to sustainable development, even though its interpretation and case law and jurisprudence have developed that further than you have in the European system. The third system that has been well established is the African Charter on the Rights and Duties of Man, and this is much more in its infancy compared to the first two, but the African Charter brings together what many call an African flavor to rights. When you look at the continent of Africa and the challenges faced, not least from the boundaries inherited from colonial rule, you would argue that development is top of the agenda. Yet, the manner in which human rights were developed and the manner in which the human rights discourse was framed see less emphasis on the right to development than in its previous two iterations in Europe and in America. Nonetheless, the African Charter has many more exhortations for development per se, and has developed some intriguing case law that you would argue is leading now in terms of regional systems on human rights and questions on development. I often conceptualize the human rights world as consisting of one big umbrella, the universal system, which is set up over the whole globe to afford protection, and then smaller regional umbrellas that allow each region to insert their own cultural values and their own challenges to make that rights regime closer to the lived experience of people in that particular area. Even if we take these three mechanisms together and you look at the coverage that they have, you will see that they actually pertain to about 40% of the world's population. And that is quite frightening. Asia consists of 57% of the world's population, and Asia has no regional system. Actually, even thinking of Asia as one unit is problematic, because you could distinguish the Middle East very clearly from Central Asia, the former Soviet states. You could distinguish that very clearly from South Asia, consisting of India, Pakistan, and others. You could distinguish that even more clearly from East Asia, consisting of China, Japan, and the Koreas and Mongolia. And again, the situations that they face are radically different from those faced in Southeast Asia. So you already have at least 5 separate sub-regions to think of in terms of the challenges they face. So getting an overarching Asian regime is close to impossible. It's also, of course, close to impossible for the very pragmatic reason that Asian regimes still are dominated by major regional rivalries. Whether that's between Saudi Arabia and Iran, whether that's between India and Pakistan, whether that's between China and Japan. These are regional rivalries that are at the forefront of politics in the region and actively prevent human rights mechanisms from developing, or in fact any kind of cooperation. Yet there is much greater emphasis on sustainable development, even though they haven't been captured in any kind of overarching document. So the challenges really exist to the extent to which, first of all, regional systems adequately protect and promote the right to sustainable development, what it means in those contexts, and questions of coverage. And fixing this regional level of protection in human rights would ultimately give us a better quality of a human rights regime.